All right. So we're diving into Adam Grant's Think again today. And, this book is all about the power of knowing what you don't know
Yeah.
and really how that can lead to personal growth, better decisions, stronger relationships,
Right.
especially, in our rapidly changing world.
Absolutely.
So we're going to go chapter by chapter
Okay.
and really try to pull out those key insights that Grant lays out.
Sounds good.
Starting right off the bat in chapter 1 with individual rethinking.
Okay.
Grant introduces these different mental modes that we often find ourselves in. And,
Yeah.
it's so easy to get stuck in these modes without even realizing it.
Absolutely.
And he lays out 4 key ones: the preacher, the prosecutor, the politician,
Right.
and then the scientist.
Yeah.
And, each of these kind of represents a different way of approaching our own ideas and the ideas of others.
For sure.
So the preacher is all about defending their beliefs, right?
Yeah, like they've got the truth and they're going to preach it.
Exactly.
No matter what.
And then you've got the prosecutor who's focused on attacking other viewpoints.
Right. They're looking to win the argument, not necessarily to find the truth.
Yeah. And then the politician.
Always trying to gain approval.
Right.
Right. Wanting to be like fitting in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And while these modes are definitely common,
Oh, yeah, we all do it.
the book argues that the most adaptive and effective stance is that of the scientist.
Okay, the scientist.
That someone who approaches ideas with a lot of curiosity, constantly testing and revising hypotheses based on evidence.
So like a more open-minded approach.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to think about, where do you find yourself most often? Are you more in defense mode, attack mode, or approval-seeking mode?
That's a good question to ask yourself.
Yeah, and the book really highlights how easily we can kind of default to those less productive roads without even realizing it.
Right. It's like our default setting.
Yeah.
And sometimes we don't even realize we're doing it.
And Grant gives this really powerful example of Mike Lazardus
Okay.
and BlackBerry.
Oh, yeah.
He was so convinced that a physical keyboard was superior
Right.
for mobile devices that he completely missed the boat on the rise of touchscreen technology.
Yeah, I remember those days.
Yeah.
Everyone had a BlackBerry.
And it's a classic example of how clinging to a belief, even one that has brought past success, can be really damaging when the landscape shifts.
It's like that saying, what got you here won't get you there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, what are those keyboards
Right.
that we're clinging to in our own lives?
Good question.
Maybe to our detriment.
Yeah, what are we missing out on?
Right.
Because we're so stuck in our ways.
Exactly. Now, in contrast to that, you have the example of Daryl Bem,
Okay.
who was a researcher whose work on ESP generated a ton of controversy.
ESP, that's extrasensory perception.
Right, like psychic abilities and stuff.
All right, yeah.
And while his findings were highly debated,
Yeah.
what's interesting is that he actively encouraged other researchers to try and disprove his work,
Oh, wow.
which is kind of the opposite of what we often see.
Yeah, most people would be defensive,
Exactly.
especially if their work was being challenged like that.
But he's like, hey, put it to the test. Let's see if it holds up.
So he was really embracing that scientific mindset.
Yeah, being open to the possibility of being wrong. And that's really, I think, the key takeaway from that example.
Yeah, it's about being willing to update your beliefs based on the evidence,
Exactly.
even if it means admitting you were wrong.
Moving on to chapter 2.
Okay.
The book kind of shifts gears a little bit to focus on how our levels of confidence
Okay.
can actually hinder our ability to rethink effectively.
So both too much confidence and too little confidence can
Exactly.
be a problem.
So on the one hand, you have overconfidence,
Right.
which can lead to, not even questioning your own assumptions.
Yeah, you think you've got it all figured out.
Right.
So why bother rethinking anything?
And then on the other hand, you have self-doubt,
Right.
which can prevent us from even considering new possibilities.
Yeah, you're so afraid of being wrong that you don't even try.
Exactly. That makes sense.
So the book introduces this concept of humble confidence.
Okay. Humble confidence.
That's kind of the ideal balance.
So it's like being confident in your ability to learn and grow,
Right.
but also acknowledging that you don't know everything.
Exactly. It's knowing your limitations, but also trusting in your capacity to learn and grow.
I like that.
Yeah. And this is where the Dunning-Kruger effect comes in,
Okay, the Dunning-Kruger effect.
which describes this cognitive bias where people with limited competence in a particular area tends to overestimate their abilities,
Right.
while experts in that same domain often underestimate their own competence.
Oh, that's interesting.
And you see this all the time, right?
Yeah.
Like someone who's brand new to a topic will speak with absolute certainty.
Yeah, like they're the expert.
Right.
Even though they just learned about it yesterday. And then you have the seasoned professionals who are much more nuanced in their views.
Right. They're more aware of the complexities.
And they're willing to acknowledge what they don't know.
Which is a sign of true expertise, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Grant uses this study with trivia players to really illustrate this point.
Okay, so how did that work?
So they had these trivia players, and the ones who were overconfident in their initial answers, they were less likely to revise those answers even when they were given clues.
Oh, way.
Compared to the people who had a moderate level of knowledge.
So the ones who were a little more humble.
Yeah, and more aware of their potential for error.
Right. They were more open to feedback.
Exactly.
That's fascinating.
And it really suggests that a little bit of knowledge can be a dangerous thing.
Yeah. It can give you a false sense of confidence.
Right.
Which can then prevent you from learning more.
Exactly.
Right.
Then in chapter 3, things get really interesting.
Okay.
Because it's titled, The Joy of Being Wrong.
The joy of being wrong.
Right. And it kind of seems counterintuitive.
Yeah, most people don't associate joy with being wrong.
But Grant's argument is that we should shift our perspective on mistakes.
Okay.
And view them not as failures,
right,
but as valuable opportunities for growth and learning.
So like reframing mistakes as learning experiences.
Exactly.
Yeah, I can see that.
And he argues that embracing being wrong can free us from that ego-driven defensiveness that often prevents us from updating our thinking.
It's like that fear of looking stupid.
Yeah.
That can hold us back.
And he shares this personal story
Okay.
about how he was teaching, and he was so attached to this particular teaching method.
Right.
Even though there was evidence suggesting that it wasn't effective.
Oh, wow.
But he didn't want to admit he was wrong.
Right.
Until he finally started seeking out student feedback.
And what happened?
Well, he realized the flaw in his approach.
Okay.
And then he revised his method and saw these improved learning outcomes.
So he was able to let go of his ego.
Yeah, and he talks about this genuine satisfaction that came from making that change.
Right? It's like the joy of learning.
Yeah, the joy of improvement.
Yeah.
And then he brings up the Wright brothers.
Wright brothers.
Inventors of the airplane.
Yeah.
And their journey was full of failures.
Right. They had a lot of crashes.
Yeah. But their key to success wasn't avoiding mistakes.
It was learning from them.
Exactly. They meticulously analyzed each failure, extracted valuable lessons, and then iteratively refined their designs.
So they embraced being wrong as part of the process.
Exactly. And that's a powerful example of how we can all approach problem solving and learning in general.
For sure.
We're moving into chapter 4.
Okay.
This is where we get into the Good Fight Club.
The Good Fight Club.
Which sounds a little intense, but it's really about the importance of constructive conflict.
Okay. Constructive conflict.
In refining our thinking.
Right, because conflict can be a good thing.
Exactly. And Grant makes this key distinction between task conflict, which is centered on the issues and ideas themselves, and relationship conflict, which gets personal and destructive.
Yeah, when it becomes about attacking the person.
Exactly.
Not the idea.
So he advocates for creating environments where ideas can be rigorously debated and stress tested without those personal attacks.
So like a safe space for intellectual starring?
Yeah, he calls them fight clubs.
Interesting.
And he gives the example of Pixar.
Pixar, the animation studio.
Yeah, they have these brain trust meetings. Which are these candid feedback sessions where filmmakers get critiques on their work in progress.
And they're not afraid, to be honest.
No, it's like no holds barred.
Wow.
And he talks about the early development of Toy Story. Where the initial portrayal of Woody was actually seen as unlikable.
Really?
Yeah, and they got that feedback. And they were able to rethink it.
Interesting.
And it's that kind of culture where even established creators are open to significant rethinking.
Yeah, that's really important.
That leads to those incredible films that they make.
Makes sense.
So now we're moving into part 2 of the book, which focuses on interpersonal rethinking.
So how we can influence others.
And be open to being influenced ourselves.
Right.
And chapter 5 is called Dances with Foes.
Dances with Foes. That's an interesting title.
It is, and it's all about the idea that engaging with people we disagree with can actually lead to shifts in perspective. As long as that engagement is rooted in active listening and a genuine attempt to find common ground.
So it's not about trying to win the argument.
Right.
It's about trying to understand each other.
Exactly. And Grant talks about motivational interviewing.
Motivational interviewing.
Which is this communication technique that focuses on using open-ended questions to
Okay.
guide individuals towards recognizing their own reasons for change.
So instead of telling them what to think, you're helping them to figure it out for themselves.
Exactly.
Interesting.
So think about questions like, what are your concerns about this?
Mhm.
Or what would need to happen for you to consider a different approach?
Right.
Those kinds of questions.
Yeah.
And he gives the example of a vaccine skeptic
Oh.
who started to reconsider their position after a healthcare provider asked, what evidence would change your mind?
Oh, wow. That's a good one.
Yeah.
It's like challenging them to really think about their beliefs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's much more effective than just lecturing them about the benefits of vaccines.
Right, because it respects their autonomy.
Exactly.
Okay, I like that approach.
And then we move into chapter 6,
Okay.
which is Bad Blood on the Diamond.
Bad blood on the diamond.
And this chapter is all about how group rivalries
Okay.
and the phenomenon of groupthink can really hinder our ability to rethink.
Right, because we get so caught up in our group identity that we can't see things objectively.
And he uses the rivalry between the New York Yankees and the Boston Red Sox
Yeah, classic rivalry.
as this example of how our loyalty to a particular group can override rational thinking.
It's like that tribal mentality.
Yeah.
We're us and they're them.
And we can't see any good in the other side.
Right, even though we might actually have a lot in common.
Exactly.
But
But then he gives this more hopeful example of a Yankees fan and a Red Sox fan who actually connected over their shared love of baseball statistics.
Oh, wow. So they found common ground.
Yeah, and that small act of finding commonality helped to bridge that divide.
That's a good reminder that we're not so different after all.
Right.
Yeah.
Then we get to chapter 7, which is Vaccine Whisperers and Mild Manners.
Vaccine whisperers.
And this chapter kind of continues that theme of effective persuasion.
Okay.
But this time, it's arguing that a gentle, respectful, and empathetic approach is much more successful than, like, those forceful or confrontational tactics.
Yeah, it's like the opposite of yelling at someone to change their mind.
Exactly.
Which never works.
And he highlights the work of these French vaccine whisperers.
Okay, vaccine whisperers, what are those?
They're healthcare professionals who have been really successful in addressing parents' anxieties about vaccination.
Okay.
And they do this by engaging in calm patient dialogue, building trust over time.
So it's about building relationships.
Yeah, rather than relying on these aggressive pro-vaccine messages.
Right, because that can just make people defensive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he gives this great example of a hesitant mother who ultimately agreed to vaccinate her child after a nurse patiently explained the risks and benefits.
Without judgment.
Yeah, without any pressure.
That's really powerful.
And it really illustrates that effectiveness of that gentle approach.
Yeah, sometimes the best way to persuade someone is to just listen to them.
Exactly.
And understand their perspective.
Now moving into part 3 of the book, we're shifting to collective rethinking.
Collective rethinking, so thinking as a group.
Yeah, how we can foster a culture of rethinking within larger groups and organizations. And chapter 8 is Charged Conversations.
Charged conversations.
Which is all about improving those polarized debates that we see so often.
Right, those debates that just seem to go nowhere.
Exactly, and his suggestion is to reframe these issues in a way that moves beyond that binary thinking.
Right, it's not always black and white.
And encourages a more nuanced exploration.
Okay, so how do we do that?
Well, he suggests shifting the focus from what questions, which often lead to those entrenched positions, to how questions which can open up possibilities for finding common ground.
Okay, so instead of arguing about what the solution is, we focus on how to get there.
Exactly.
Interesting.
So, for example, instead of debating what the best approach to healthcare is,
which is a very divisive issue.
Yeah, we could ask how we can improve healthcare access and outcomes for everyone.
Right, because everyone wants good healthcare.
Exactly. Yeah. And by focusing on that process and those desired outcomes, we can often sidestep those deeply entrenched disagreements about what the ultimate solution should be.
It's like finding a common goal.
Yeah.
And then working together to figure out how to achieve it.
Exactly.
I like that.
And he gives the example of gun control debates, which are so polarized.
Yeah, people are either for it or against it.
But if we reframe the conversation around how to reduce gun violence,
it
allows for a much broader discussion.
Right.
It can encompass strategies like background checks, mental health support, community programs.
Yeah, it takes the focus off of the guns themselves.
Then puts it on the actual problem.
Which is the violence.
Right.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So chapter 9 is rewriting the textbook.
Rewriting the textbook.
And this chapter really delves into the role of education in cultivating a rethinking mindset.
So how we teach kids to think critically.
Exactly. And his argument is that education should prioritize teaching students how to question, analyze, and rethink, rather than just focusing on memorizing facts.
Right, because memorization doesn't really teach you how to think.
Exactly. It's just rote learning.
Yeah.
And he criticizes that traditional model of education and advocates for active learning approaches.
Active learning.
Which encourage students to ask questions, challenge assumptions, engage in deeper exploration of concepts.
So more hands-on learning.
Yeah.
I like that.
And he gives this example of a teacher who encouraged students to rewrite historical events from the perspectives of different groups who were involved.
Oh, wow.
So, for instance, having them consider Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas from the viewpoint of the Native Americans.
That's a really interesting exercise.
It forces students to question that dominant narrative and consider alternative interpretations.
Yeah, it helps them to see things from different angles.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And finally, we get to chapter 10.
Okay, the last chapter of part 3.
Yes, which is, that's not the way we've always done it.
That's not the way we've always done it.
Which is all about how organizations can get stuck in a rut.
Right.
If they don't actively foster a culture of rethinking.
Yeah, they can become resistant to change.
Exactly, even when those old ways of doing things are no longer effective.
It's like they're stuck in the past.
Yeah, and he cites the Challenger space shuttle disaster.
Oh, wow.
As a tragic illustration of what can happen.
Right.
When we don't rethink safety protocols.
Even when they're warning signs.
Yeah. And in this case, engineers had actually warned about potential risks, but the launch proceeded because of this history of past successes.
Oh, wow. That's a powerful example of the dangers of complacency.
It is.
Yeah.
But then he gives this more positive example of a company that decided to ditch their annual performance reviews. Yeah, because they realized that they were actually demotivating employees.
Interesting.
And hindering growth.
Yeah.
So they switched to a system of more frequent feedback and coaching. Which is a great example of an organization being willing to rethink.
Yeah.
Even a really long-standing practice.
Right, because sometimes those old ways of doing things just don't work anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And finally, we get to the last part of the book, part 4. Which concludes with chapter 11, Escaping Tunnel Vision.
Escaping tunnel vision.
And this chapter emphasizes the importance of making rethinking a lifelong habit.
Right, because the world is constantly changing.
Exactly. So we need to be able to adapt.
Yeah.
And he introduces this idea of a rethinking scorecard.
A rethinking scorecard.
Yeah, it's basically a tool for tracking beliefs that you've questioned. And maybe even changed your mind about.
So it's like a way to keep track of your intellectual growth.
Exactly. And he shares this really powerful story about a firefighter who had this near-fatal experience.
Oh, wow.
And it really prompted him to rethink his entire career path.
Yeah, sometimes it takes a major event like that.
To shake things out.
To make you reevaluate your priorities.
Exactly. So in wrapping up, Think, again, is really making this case that rethinking isn't a sign of weakness or indecisiveness, but rather it's this vital skill that we can all develop and refine.
It's about being open-minded.
Exactly.
And willing to change your mind.
And the book is just full of these compelling stories and research from the rise and fall of BlackBerry to the dynamics at Pixar to vaccine hesitancy that really illustrate the benefits of knowing what we don't know.
It's about embracing uncertainty and being willing to learn and grow.
Exactly.
I like that.
So to conclude our deep dive into Think Again, the key takeaway is that rethinking is crucial for personal growth, for making better decisions, and for navigating our ever-changing world.
And for building stronger relationships.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that's a great takeaway.
So what are your thoughts?
Well, I think this book offers a really valuable framework for thinking about how we think.
It does.
And gives us practical tools that we can use to become more open-minded and adaptable.
Yeah.
Which is so important in today's world.
Absolutely.
So I would definitely recommend it to anyone who's looking to grow and learn.
Yeah, I think it's a must-read.
For sure.
Well, this has been a fantastic discussion.
It has.
I always enjoy diving into these books with you.
Likewise.
And I think our listeners will get a lot out of this as well.
I hope so.
So until next time, Keep those minds open.
And keep rethinking.